Hi, my name is Tom Johnson. I'm a technical writer based in Seattle with a blog I'dratherBeWriting.com. I've got a series of prompt engineering techniques that I'm going over today. And previously, I talked a little bit about how to take information that you pull from engineers and get really clear, kind of summarized meanings as a result that you can pass in as source material for your prompts. But in this video, what I want to do is go over techniques for just gathering source material in general for context input. This is probably the best strategy for making AI work for you. You've got to gather a lot of good source material and use that as context input because you're documenting stuff that doesn't exist on the web usually. It doesn't really have a lot of material that's been published. I mean, as a technical writer, you're creating this initial source material. So the first step, and this is usually for big projects, not necessarily small little updates that you're making here and there, but let's say you're documenting a new API, right? You want to first gather source material for whatever documentation you're going to be writing using AI. Okay, so let me cover a few best practices here about like whether you should do quality versus quantity, potential like gaps or bias in the source material, and so on. But this is really part of this larger strategy. Before we jump into the details, it's part of this larger strategy of retrieval augmented generation, or RAG, where you take and supplement an LLM with additional material and context that becomes part of its input. It makes all the difference in the world. Like, this is basically how you use AI. You find a bunch of material that can serve as a source of truth. You pass it in as context into the AI interface, and suddenly the outputs are much more accurate, precise, like relevant, useful. All right, so let's look at some of these best practices on gathering source material. And by the way, source material exists in a lot of internal documents for any project. People don't just start writing code. I mean, by the time engineers actually get down to writing code, somebody has written a product pitch of some kind. Every company has its own nomenclature for these documents. Maybe you have a two-pager or something that outlines what the product is. Once it gets approved, maybe there's an engineering design document where they talk about different approaches, the pros and cons, and so on. There could be even like a security document about how the product will be secure. There could be a competitive analysis. I mean, there's a lot of internal documentation that is written for any major feature. So you want to start gathering this, right? But now let's say you have a dozen different documents of all different flavors and purposes. Maybe you also have like reference. Maybe the API has already been kind of coded and you've got a reference output. Well, you want to prefer quality over quantity because all of this information that you're gathering can kind of be a bit noisy if it's not relevant. So look through the documents you've got, and if parts of them are just like gonna potentially confuse the AI, then you can leave it out. But in general, most of this source material can be useful and highly relevant. All right, be aware of source material bias and focus. Now, when I talk about bias, I'm not so much referring to like gender or racial biases here, although depending upon your product, that could definitely be something to look at. I'm looking more at like feature slants. Let's say that the API that's being developed is a variant of another API, but this variant that's being developed is gonna have a couple of new features that the other API doesn't. Well, all the internal documentation might focus on these new features that this variant API has and neglect to kind of go into detail about the existing features that are just being kind of copied over. So that is something to consider. Like, what, like, how is the information shaped around a particular product? Is it well-rounded? Is it based on a certain use case that the product is trying to achieve? Maybe a lot of attention is being focused on a really difficult part for like the back end and the setup, but is not really relevant to the way users or developers would actually use the product. So you could have a lot of like different emphases in the source material that might not correspond with the needed emphasis in the documentation. That's something to look at. There's not a lot you can really do here. Just be aware of it, right? You still want to gather this information. Now you might, this technique really depends on which AI tool you're using. But let's say you gather 100 pages of information, right? Which sounds like a lot, but really if you've got 20 pages of product overview, you've got 65 pages of just reference output, and you've got other documents, it can really add up. And so you might not be able to pass all of this into a chat session all at once. You might want to break it up into like several chunks. Sometimes that works. It really depends on the tool. You might have limits about how much input context it can take all at once. And if you do break it up, you can use a prompt like this. Like, I'm going to ask you for help with a writing task, but I first want to load in a lot of source material for you to draw upon. The source material is extensive, so I need to load it in several chunks rather than all at once. Sit tight while I load the information into the context window here. I don't want you to do anything yet. Just acknowledge that you received the source material. Here's the first chunk, and so on. So it's really hard for these tools to kind of not do anything when you pass it a bunch of info. So my attempt to get it to sit tight while I load the information isn't always something that the tools follow, in my experience. Anyway, it's kind of exciting once you gather all this material because you suddenly realize that, oh my gosh, there is a ton of material. I mean, this is like tech writing 101 before you start writing about anything, is you want to gather all the material that you can find about the product, because that will inform you about things. Another point that I didn't actually list here, should have, is that a lot of times the material could be outdated. As people are coming up with the design and the development and the plan, it's more of a brainstorm. It's kind of like writing a blog post where you have an outline. What are the chances that the outline of your blog post will exactly match the kind of article that you end up writing? There's usually a lot of kind of discovery in the moment, or things that come up that you didn't anticipate that cause you to take a certain direction that wasn't reflected in that brainstorm. It's the same with source material. Source material might talk a lot about, oh, we're going to use this method and so on. And then when the engineers actually get down to coding it, they realize there's a better way. And so they make some updates. And then suddenly your source material has all kinds of references to something that's no longer true and relevant. This is an easy way for the AI to be misled by outdated information. So if you're reading through the source material and you see stuff that isn't true, or which you know has been changed, you want to just remove that. One common thing to look for is like engineering design documents that look at the pros and cons of different techniques, and they choose the technique they think is best. But the document might leave in the other techniques just as historical material without even labeling that they were not chosen to be implemented. All right. Before we jump into some other points here, I want to take a quick break, and we're going to hear a message from our sponsors. This is actually a clip from a podcast, an excerpt from a podcast that I did with Karen Brown at Zoom In Software on uncovering and communicating the value of your TechCom work. How do technical writers kind of find out what these business goals are, the high priority business goals that a company has? Is there like a good way to figure this out?
This is such a good question, Tom. And I think one of the first things that come up when we have these value conversations with technical writers is A, how would I know? And B, how would I actually get the data that I don't have at my fingertips? For example, the NPS score or the self service rate, right? So usually these are performance indicators that lie either in some other business unit or within your support organization or maybe your customer success organization. And so, one of the first things that we are doing, again, when we kick off these value conversations, is identify together who are the stakeholders we need to bring into this project, right? You really cannot tie your value to the business goals of the company if you don't understand what your VP support cares about or being measured on, or what are the quarterly deliverables of your customer success team. And what we've seen is that the value conversation has become such a wonderful trigger for technical writers to come out of their shell in a way and their isolation and actually start looking and understanding what's going on with other teams in the company. And usually they find out great things. They find out new audiences that are using the content and new audiences that, use it to actually meet their own goals, which is great.
All right, we are back here. So, another tip, once you've gathered all of this information into your chat session, actually, let me hit one more point here before I get to that final tip. Consider how you order and organize the information. There might be a preferred order to source material. Consider putting maybe the basic information first as kind of an introduction and then more advanced information. I don't know how necessary and useful this is, but in general, like the way humans would interpret something is you would get kind of an overview and an explanation and high level, and then dive more into progressively technical and specific detail. And if LLMs have similar kind of comprehension approaches there, then that would work. I think it's a general best practice. I usually put the reference documentation somewhat after the product 2-page or overview. It seems like it's a good practice. Okay, so after you've gathered all this information, you've loaded it as context into your session, and you can even do whatever you want with it, right? Whatever documentation scenario that you have. You want to save the chat session so that anytime you now need to jump back into that context, you've already got a chat session that's preloaded with all the information that you need for working with that product. I usually don't keep these sessions around too much longer, but definitely if I'm working on different parts of documentation, I definitely save this, and it is useful. I'm going to talk about change list diffs a little bit later, so I will skip that part. I talked about filling in the gaps with meeting notes in a previous tutorial here, but for sure, like all of these documents that you're gathering, they're not going to provide all the information you need. You'll need to meet with people and ask them questions, and you'll want to use those meeting notes as well as part of the source input. You could also grab your source code and pass that in if you're allowed to. Again, see your company's specific IT policies about whether you can do this or not. But let's say you have a bunch of engineering source files. That might be redundant with the reference output, or it might not. So you could consider passing that in. Keep in mind that it might have a bunch of internal comments as well that you wouldn't want to come out in your output. Let's see, one other point to consider: rendered versus source. Let's say you're gathering all the reference output. Let's say you have a Java doc Would you grab the HTML or just copy and paste the output, the rendered output on the page? I think probably it's better to include the HTML tags, though that can create a lot of noise, and it depends how much content you're up against. If you're hitting your max, you're hitting your however many tokens allowed limit, you might want to just maybe grab the relevant pages that you think are the most useful and skip the HTML source. Okay, so basically this post is all about kind of prepping and getting ready to do prompts that will guide AI to write documentation. You're in the gathering phase, and this is very similar to writing. I mean, probably the first step to any kind of writing process is gathering information. If you were doing a research paper, you would first gather a bunch of research about the topic and read through it, and so on. I mean, it's the exact same process here. And I think one of the reasons AI might get a bad rap from some writers who dismiss it is because they don't do the necessary preparation by gathering and vetting and kind of parsing the source material so that it's an accurate, reliable source before they jump into the prompts. But once you have this source material, it is gold. It really helps the output be accurate and on target with exactly what you're trying to do. Like I said, there are many pitfalls, and if the output is inaccurate or the output has an error, look back and see if that error exists in your source material, because a lot of times it does. There was one instance where I felt like I was being gaslighted because the AI output kept mentioning a certain method that did not exist in the reference, and I was like, where did it get this method? Of course, it was in the engineering design document. It was clearly referenced in code samples and other kind of discussions. But at some point, people decided, no, we don't need that method, and so my output had this error that needed to be fixed. So I'm going to talk later about how you can do some fact checking and error checking of your output, maybe against the reference, to see if there's pieces that don't quite match. But we'll get to that in another video. Again, my name is Tom Johnson. My blog is I'dRatherBeWriting.com. You can find many of these techniques under the TechWriter plus AI prompt engineering menu. Thanks for listening.